Shadow Garden Blood. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ailey, and I'm so glad you've joined us. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from and how did your day go? Leave a comment and let's share a moment together. Don't forget to subscribe for new stories daily. Now, let's start tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. The Prize Garden. The village of St. Mary Mead lay drowsing in the golden warmth of early June, and Miss Jane Marple, walking slowly along the high street with her shopping basket over her arm, reflected that there were few things more pleasant than an English summer morning when the roses were just coming into their full glory. She paused to admire a particularly fine display of hybrid teas in the window of the greengrocer's shop, their petals the color of fresh cream tinged with the faintest blush of pink. They reminded her of young Mrs. Blackett at the post office, who had married above her station and still carried that same mixture of pride and uncertainty in her manner. "Good morning, Miss Marple," came a cheerful voice, and Miss Marple turned to see Mrs. Dolly Bantry approaching, slightly out of breath and looking unusually animated. "My dear Dolly," Miss Marple said warmly, "you look as though you've been hurrying. Nothing wrong, I hope?" "Wrong? Quite the opposite. I've just been putting the finishing touches on my sweet pea exhibit for this afternoon. The garden show, you know. You haven't forgotten." Miss Marple had not forgotten, though she had considered whether her knees would quite tolerate an afternoon of standing about on the lawns of the village hall. However, the village garden show was one of those institutions which, like the church fete and the Christmas pantomime, formed the very fabric of St. Mary Mead society, and one did not lightly absent oneself. "I shall be there," she assured Mrs. Bantry, "though I confess my own poor efforts in the herbaceous border category can hardly compete with some of the more ambitious entries." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, my dear, I think we all know who'll be taking home the Rose Prize again. Mr. Carter has been insufferably smug about those specimens of his. I caught him yesterday morning practically standing guard over them with a watering can. You'd think they were the crown jewels." Miss Marple's eyes, very bright and blue behind her spectacles, rested thoughtfully on her friend's face. "Mr. Carter is very devoted to his work. A dedicated gardener is rather like a devoted mother, don't you think? So very protective of their charges. Devoted is one word for it," Mrs. Bantry said with a sniff. "Mrs. Greystone told me only last week that he's become quite impossible. Won't let anyone else near the rose garden. Treats the place as though it were his own rather than hers. But then he was with old Mr. Greystone for 20 years before the poor man died. I suppose he feels some sense of ownership." And then they walked together toward the village hall, where bunting had been strung between the chestnut trees and trestle tables were being arranged on the lawn. Already the air was filled with the competing fragrances of early summer blooms, and villagers were arriving with their carefully tended entries, each pot and vase handled with the solemnity usually reserved for religious relics. Miss Marple observed the scene with the gentle attention she brought to all human activity. There was young Tom Fletcher, the butcher's boy, carrying his mother's dahlias with exaggerated care. There was Colonel Bantry, looking slightly harassed as he supervised the positioning of the judge's table. And there, emerging from a gleaming black motor car at the gates, was Mrs. Lydia Greystone herself. She was a striking woman, Miss Marple thought, though perhaps not quite in her first youth, somewhere in her late 30s, with dark hair dressed in the latest fashion and an elegant navy dress that must have come from London. There was something in her bearing that suggested a woman who had married well and knew it, but also something else, something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. Attention, perhaps, like a wire pulled just slightly too taut. "Poor Lydia," Mrs. Bantry murmured, following Miss Marple's gaze. "She's had rather a difficult time of it since Henry died last year. The estate's been dreadfully expensive to maintain, and I don't think she finds village life quite as charming as she pretended when she first arrived. She was a London girl originally, you know. Henry swept her off her feet at some gallery opening or other. Mrs. Greystone approached the display tables with a polite smile fixed upon her face, nodding to various villagers as she passed. She did not, Miss Marple noticed, make any move toward the rose section, where a tall, spare man in his late 50s was already arranging 3 perfect blooms in a crystal vase. Mr. Edwin Carter had the weathered complexion and strong, capable hands of a man who had spent his life working with soil and growing things. His face was set in lines of concentration as he adjusted the position of his roses, turning them minutely to catch the light. He wore his best suit, somewhat old-fashioned in cut, and his boots, though polished, bore the permanent staining of rich earth that no amount of cleaning could quite remove. "Magnificent specimens," called out the vicar, pausing in his rounds of greeting. "I think we can safely predict the outcome of the rose category this year." Carter's face creased in what might have been pleasure, or might have been something more complicated. "They've done well enough," he said gruffly. "The soil's been good to them. Mr. Greystone always said that a garden knows when it's properly tended. These roses, they remember him, I'd say." It was an odd turn of phrase, and Miss Marple saw Mrs. Greystone's shoulders stiffen slightly where she stood, examining a display of sweet williams several yards away. The judging began promptly at 3 tourbouts, and the assembled villagers watched with a keen attention that only an English village can bring to matters of horticultural competition. Miss Marple found herself positioned near the rose display, close enough to observe both Mr. Carter's barely suppressed satisfaction and Mrs. Greystone's studied indifference, when the judge, a pompous gentleman from the County Horticultural Society, finally announced Mr. Carter as the winner of the rose category for the 7th consecutive year. The applause was generous, if unsurprising. Carter stepped forward to accept his ribbon and small silver cup, his face flushed with pleasure. "I'd like to dedicate this to the memory of Mr. Henry Greystone," he said, his voice carrying across the lawn. "A true gentleman who understood what it meant to tend a proper garden." Miss Marple's keen gaze shifted to Mrs. Greystone at these words. The widow's face had gone quite pale, and her gloved hands were clasped together tightly. When their eyes met across the crowd, Mrs. Greystone looked away with deliberate precision, turning her back on both the rose display and its triumphant gardener. "How very awkward," Mrs. Bantry whispered. "Did you see that? She couldn't even bring herself to congratulate him." Miss Marple said nothing, but her busy mind was already noting and filing away this small but significant detail. In her experience, which was considerable, the strongest emotions were often revealed not in what people said or did, but in what they conspicuously refused to do. As the afternoon drew on, and tea was served from large urns on the trestle tables, Miss Marple noticed Mr. Carter and Mrs. Greystone standing at opposite ends of the lawn, like 2 magnets with their poles reversed. When Carter finally departed, walking briskly up the lane that led to Greystone Lodge, Mrs. Greystone's rigid posture seemed to ease slightly, though her expression remained troubled. "It's been a lovely afternoon," Miss Marple said to Mrs. Bantry as they prepared to leave. "Though I fancy there may be rain tonight. One can smell it in the air, don't you think?" But it was not rain that would disturb the peace of St. Mary Mead that evening. It was something far darker, and by the next morning, the prize roses at Greystone Lodge would bear witness to something no garden show could judge or celebrate: a force that comes from a violent struggle. More importantly, there's blood on the thorn itself, and it doesn't match Carter's type. The room fell silent. Miss Marple looked from Hill to Mrs. Greystone and back again. "I see," she said quietly. "Mr. Hill, I think it's time you told us what really happened on Sunday night." Hill's shoulders sagged. "I thought I could protect her. I thought if I took all the blame, said it was my idea, that she'd only been drawn into it unwillingly, they might be lenient with her. James, no. Mrs. Greystone said desperately. You mustn't, but Hill continued, his voice flat with defeat. The truth is, I did go to the greenhouse that night, but not to kill Carter. I went because Mrs. Greystone had told me she was meeting him, and I was worried about what he might do. I know the property well enough to move about unseen, so I positioned myself near the greenhouse, where I could watch without being observed. He paused, his hands clenching on the table. I saw Mrs. Greystone arrive just after 9, saw her go inside. At first I could only hear voices, angry but not violent. Then suddenly Carter shouted something, and there was a struggle. I ran to help, but by the time I reached the greenhouse door, it was already over. Carter lunged at me, Mrs. Greystone said, her voice breaking. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. I pulled away and back toward the workbench, and he came after me, shouting about how I owed him, how my husband had promised him security for keeping silent about the affair. He reached for me again, and I grabbed the first thing my hand touched, the pruning shears. Miss Marple listened with the careful attention she brought to all human confession. You struck him with the shears. I pushed them at him, trying to make him back away, but he lurched forward at the same moment, and the blades caught him across the neck. There was so much blood, so sudden he fell, and I just stood there, unable to move, unable to think. That's when I came in, Hill said. I found her standing over the body, these shears still in her hand, blood on her dress. She was in shock, barely able to speak. I took the shears from her, checked Carter, and knew immediately he was dead. And you decided to help her conceal what had happened, Miss Marple said. What else could I do? I love her. I've loved her since the day I drove her down from London as a new bride. I watched her suffer through her husband's infidelities. I watched Carter torment her with his threats. I couldn't let her hang for defending herself against that monster. Mrs. Greystone moved to stand beside him, her hand reaching for his. James tried to protect me from my own actions. He moved the body, hid the evidence, and when you started asking questions, Miss Marple, he decided to confess to everything, so I could claim I'd only helped him dispose of the body after the fact. But I won't let him do it. I won't let him sacrifice himself for my crime. Miss Marple studied them both. These two people, bound together by love and by guilt, and saw in their faces something she had seen many times before in her long years of observing human nature, the i.e., terrible clarity that comes when all pretense has been stripped away. The thorn on Mr. Hill's jacket, she said slowly. It came from the climbing roses near the greenhouse door. You caught yourself on them when you rushed in to help Mrs. Greystone. Yes, Hill admitted. I didn't even notice it at the time. There was too much else to think about. Constable Polk had been making copious notes throughout this exchange. Now he set down his pencil and looked at them both with something like pity. I'll need formal statements from both of you, but I think, in light of these revelations, that the charge may be somewhat different than we initially thought. Mrs. Greystone, you'll be charged with manslaughter, not murder. And Mr. Hill, you'll be charged with being an accessory after the fact, and with conspiring to pervert the course of justice. As they were led away, Mrs. Greystone turned back to look at Miss Marple. How did you know? How did you see through all our careful plans? Miss Marple met her gaze steadily. Because careful plans, my dear, are made by careful people. And neither you nor Mr. Hill are naturally deceptive. Every lie you told was contradicted by some small truth you couldn't quite conceal. The torn dress, the footprints walking calmly away, the evidence buried but not destroyed. You both wanted too much to protect each other, and in that very desire to shield one another, you revealed yourselves. After they had gone, Miss Marple remained for a moment in the quiet police house, gathering her thoughts. Dr. Haydock approached her, his expression thoughtful. That thorn was the key to it all, wasn't it? Without it, we might never have known Hill was telling lies to protect her. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, though I think I would have puzzled it out eventually. Love, doctor, leaves traces just as surely as hatred does. And sometimes those traces are as small and as sharp as a thorn that draws blood. Chapter 10. The Shadow Lifted. The trial of Lydia Greystone and James Hill took place at the county assizes in late September, when the roses at Greystone Lodge had begun their second bloom and St. Mary Mead had settled into the gentle rhythm of autumn. Miss Marple attended each day of the proceedings, sitting quietly in the public gallery with her knitting bag on her lap, observing the drama unfold with the same careful attention she brought to all human behavior. The prosecution, led by a sharp-featured barrister from London, painted a picture of conspiracy and cold-blooded murder. But the defense, aided considerably by Miss Marple's own testimony about the evidence of struggle and Mrs. Greystone's genuine distress, argued persuasively for a verdict of manslaughter in the case of Mrs. Greystone and for leniency toward Mr. Hill, whose crime had been born of misguided devotion rather than malice. The jury, after deliberating for 7 hours, returned with verdicts that reflected the complexity of the case. Mrs. Greystone was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment. Mr. Hill, guilty of accessory after the fact, received 3 years. As they were led from the courtroom, their hands briefly touched, and Miss Marple, watching from her seat, thought that even in their tragedy, there was something of dignity in the way they faced their punishment together. Afterward, Mrs. Bantry found Miss Marple in the tea room across from the courthouse, staring into her cup with an expression of profound sadness. "You did what was right, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said gently. "You found the truth and justice was served." "Justice?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose it was, though I can't help but wonder whether true justice would have addressed itself to Mr. Henry Greystone and his faithlessness, or to Edwin Carter, and his cruel exploitation of another's shame. We punished the desperate and the devoted, while the original sins that set everything in motion go unremarked." "You think Mrs. Greystone was justified in killing Carter?" "No, not justified. But I understand how she arrived at that terrible moment in the greenhouse, with a blackmailer before her and years of humiliation behind her. We speak of self-defense as though it only applies to physical danger. But there are other kinds of assault, aren't there? Assaults on one's dignity, one's peace of mind, one's very ability to live without fear. Carter was guilty of all of these. And while that doesn't excuse what happened, it perhaps explains it." She set down her cup with a small sigh. "The tragedy is that if Mrs. Greystone had simply reported Carter's blackmail to the authorities, he would have been arrested and prosecuted, and she would have remained free. But shame is a powerful thing, Dolly. It makes us believe that exposure is worse than any other fate. And so we make choices we would never otherwise make." They returned to St. Mary Mead as the afternoon light was fading, painting the village in shades of gold and amber. The church bells were ringing for evensong, and villagers were going about their ordinary business, already beginning to fold the scandal of Greystone Lodge into the fabric of local legend. Over the following weeks, Miss Marple found herself often walking past Greystone Lodge, observing how the property slowly settled into neglect. The gardens, once so meticulously maintained, began to show signs of abandonment. Weeds crept into the borders, roses went unpruned, and the greenhouse stood empty and gathering dust. It was Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, who brought news of the estate's future one morning in early November. "I've heard that Greystone Lodge is to be sold," she said as they met outside the post office. "Mrs. Greystone's solicitor has arranged for the proceeds to be held in trust until her release." The villagers are saying she'll never come back here, that she'll start fresh somewhere else when her sentence is served. I expect they're right, Miss Marple said. Some places hold too many dark memories to ever be home again, though I hope wherever she goes that she finds some measure of peace. Do you think she and Hill will marry when they're both released? Miss Marple considered this. I think they're bound together now by something stronger than marriage, and more terrible than love. Whether that bond will sustain them or destroy them, only time will tell. Shared guilt can be as powerful a tie as shared joy, though far less comfortable to live with. December brought the first snow to St. Mary Mead, and with it the preparations for the Christmas season. The tragedy at Greystone Lodge had receded in most minds, replaced by more immediate concerns of carol services and parish socials. But Miss Marple, sitting by her fire on a cold evening, found her thoughts returning to that June afternoon at the garden show, when she'd first noticed the tension between Mrs. Greystone and Edwin Carter. If she had acted more quickly, she sometimes wondered, might she have prevented what followed? But such thoughts were futile. One could not prevent human nature from expressing itself, could not stop the collision of pride and shame and desperate love that had ended in death. Mrs. Bantry visited on Christmas Eve, bringing mince pies and news of the village. Greystone Lodge has been sold, she announced. A couple from Birmingham, quite respectable. They're planning to restore the gardens come spring. And Jane, you'll never guess what they found when they were clearing out the greenhouse. A whole shelf of notebooks. Carter's garden journals going back 20 years. Detailed records of everything he planted, every cutting he took, every prize he won. How very like him, Miss Marple observed. A methodical man to the end. I suppose those journals will be valuable to the new owners. That's not all they found. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. There was another notebook hidden behind the others, a sort of diary, apparently, in which Carter recorded all manner of observations about the Greystone household. Not just Mr. Greystone's affair, but other things, too. Financial irregularities, questionable business dealings. The man was sitting on enough scandal to ruin half the county families. Miss Marple shook her head slowly. Knowledge is a dangerous thing when held by the wrong person. Carter must have spent years accumulating these secrets, perhaps thinking they were a form of insurance against poverty in his old age. But secrets are rather like certain plants, Dolly. They may start small and harmless, but if left to grow unchecked, they can choke the life from everything around them. What will happen to the notebooks? I imagine the solicitors will review them and take appropriate action where necessary, though I suspect most of what Carter knew will remain buried. Society has a remarkable ability to forgive and forget when it suits its purposes. As Mrs. Bantry prepared to leave, she paused at the door. You know, Jane, there's talk in the village about the roses at Greystone Lodge. They say that come summer, they'll bloom more brilliantly than ever because of all the blood that was spilled there. Miss Marple rose to see her friend out, her expression thoughtful. It's an old wives' tale, of course, that blood feeds roses. Though there's a kernel of truth in most old tales, isn't there? Violence does leave its mark on a place. Makes things grow differently, whether we can see it or not. She stood at her cottage door, watching Mrs. Bantry make her way down the snowy lane. The village lay quiet under its white blanket, peaceful and innocent as a Christmas card. But Miss Marple knew, as she had always known, that beneath the surface of even the most tranquil scene, there ran currents of passion and pain, and the eternal human capacity for both love and destruction. When spring came, she walked past Greystone Lodge one morning and saw that the new owners had indeed begun their restoration. The gardens were being cleared and replanted, the greenhouse cleaned and stocked with new seedlings. And in the rose garden, where Edwin Carter had been found dead, the climbing roses were putting forth their early shoots, reaching upward toward the sun with the blind optimism of all growing things. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her keen eyes taking in the scene. A young gardener was at work among the beds, whistling as he pruned and shaped and encouraged new growth. Life, as always, was asserting itself over death, renewal over decay. "They always do," she murmured to herself, thinking of that afternoon in June and all that followed. "They always bloom brightest after tragedy feeds the roots, though whether that's a comfort or a warning, I've never quite decided." She turned away from Greystone Lodge and made her way back to her cottage, her knitting bag over her arm, and her thoughts already moving to the next small mystery that village life would inevitably present. For that was the nature of things, she reflected. Shadows fell and were lifted. Gardens grew and were neglected and grew again. And through it all, human nature remained, wonderfully, terribly, eternally, the same. Chapter 2. A Walk Among the Roses. Miss Marple was in her garden shortly after 8:00 the following morning, cutting a few sprigs of lavender for the linen cupboard, when she heard the sound of hurried footsteps on the road. Looking up, she saw young Dr. Haydock's car racing past toward Greystone Lodge at a speed quite unsuited to the narrow lane. She straightened slowly, her hand resting on the garden gate. In a village like St. Mary Mead, one learned to read the signs. A doctor driving at speed on a Sunday morning meant only one thing, and Miss Marple found herself thinking of Mr. Carter's flushed, triumphant face from the previous afternoon. It was perhaps 20 minutes later when Mrs. Bantry telephoned, her voice high and breathless with shock. "Jane, the most dreadful thing. Mr. Carter has been found dead in the rose garden at Greystone Lodge. They're saying it was an accident with his pruning shears, but oh, my dear, it's too horrible to think about." Miss Marple listened carefully to her friend's agitated account, asked one or two quiet questions, and then suggested that she might walk up to The Lodge herself if Mrs. Bantry thought her presence would not be an intrusion. An intrusion? My dear, I'm sure poor Mrs. Greystone would be glad of the support. She's quite beside herself, naturally. Dr. Haydock is with her now. And that officious Constable Polk is stomping about examining things in that heavy-handed way of his. The morning had turned overcast, and a cool breeze rustled through the hedge as Miss Marple made her way up the lane. She walked slowly, partly from necessity and partly from habit, for she had long ago learned that observation required patience. One notices far more at a walking pace than one ever does rushing about in motor cars. Greystone Lodge was a handsome Queen Anne house set back from the road, its red brick walls softened by climbing roses and wisteria. The famous walled garden lay to the eastern side, accessible through a wooden door set into the old stone wall. This door now stood open, and Miss Marple could see several figures moving about within. Mrs. Bantry met her at the entrance, looking pale but eager to share what she had learned. "They found him this morning at 7, she whispered. The housemaid, Annie, went to take him his early tea as usual, and discovered him lying among the rose bushes near the south wall. His pruning shears were beside him, and there was a cut across his neck. Dr. Haydock says he must have fallen while working on the climbing roses and caught himself on this shears." "A tragic accident. How very unfortunate," Miss Marple murmured. "Though I must confess I should not have thought Mr. Carter the type of man to fall while pruning. He seemed remarkably steady on his feet." They passed through the walled garden, and Miss Marple paused to take in the scene. It was a beautiful space, perhaps half an acre, laid out with geometric precision. Rose beds alternated with narrow brick paths, and against the southern wall, a magnificent display of climbing roses cascaded downward from their supports. Constable Polk, a large man with a round red face, was standing near one of the beds, making notes in his official notebook. Near his feet, a white chalk outline marked where the body had lain. "Straightforward case, Miss Marple," he announced when he saw her. "Sad business, but clear enough." Carter was up on his ladder, lost his balance, and the shears did for him. These accidents happen in gardening, even to experienced men. Miss Marple moved closer, her eyes scanning the ground with careful attention. "I wonder," she said gently, "whether I might kneel down for a moment. My eyes are not what they were, and I should so like to see where the poor man fell." Constable Polk looked dubious but stepped aside. Miss Marple knelt with some difficulty on the brick path, her gaze moving systematically across the soil at the base of the roses. "His hands were quite clean, I suppose?" she asked after a moment. Polk consulted his notebook. "Clean enough, yes." "What of it?" "Only that a gardener who has been pruning roses usually has stained fingers. The sap, you know, and the earth. It's remarkably persistent." She leaned forward slightly. "And the cut to his neck, that was quite precise, I understand." "Clean as a razor," Polk confirmed, then seemed to regret his choice of words. "That is to say, a single cut, very sharp. The shears were freshly honed." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Her attention focused on the soil beneath the roses. The earth here was soft and well-tended, and in its surface she could see quite clearly the impression of footprints. One set was heavy and deep, the prints of a man's boots pressed firmly into the soil. But there was another set, lighter and less distinct, as though someone had walked here and then attempted to obscure their passage by dragging something across the marks. "How curious," she murmured, half to herself. "What's that, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Bantry asked, peering down. "Oh, nothing important, I'm sure. Only that there seem to be two sets of footprints here, and one appears to have been partly erased. Rather like when one makes a mistake in a letter and tries to blot it out, but the impression of the pen remains in the paper." Constable Polk frowned and bent to look. "Could be anyone's prints. The gardener's boy comes through here, and Mrs. Greystone walks in the garden most mornings." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed, rising carefully to her feet with Mrs. Bantry's assistance. "I wonder, though, about the timing. Mr. Carter left the garden show yesterday at approximately 4. The vicar mentioned hearing shouts from this direction sometime after 9 in the evening. That's quite a gap, isn't it? What was Mr. Carter doing during those hours?" "Having his supper, I should think," Polk said impatiently. "His rooms are above the old stables, just beyond the kitchen garden. He'd have eaten, perhaps had a pipe, then come out for a final inspection of his roses. The man was devoted to them. Everyone knew that." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze traveling across the garden. "It's curious," she said quietly, "how murder and gardening both depend on knowing what to cover and what to leave showing. A good gardener understands that certain things must be buried deep, while others must be brought into the light to flourish." There was a small silence. Mrs. Bantry looked startled, and Constable Polk's face reddened. "Murder, Miss Marple? I think you're letting your imagination run away with you. This was an accident, pure and simple. Perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly, "though I have always found that accidents, like gardens, benefit from careful examination. One must look beneath the surface to understand what truly grows there." She turned to go, then paused as though struck by an afterthought. "The shears?" "Constable. They were lying beside Mr. Carter's hand, I assume." "That's right. Right beside the body. Not clutched in his hand. Not thrown some distance by the force of his fall." Polk consulted his notes again, his frown deepening. "Just beside it, as you say." "Thank you," Miss Marple said. "That's most helpful." As they walked back toward the house, Mrs. Bantry whispered urgently, "Jane, you don't really think it was murder, do you? Who on earth would want to kill a gardener?" Miss Marple paused to examine a bed of white lilies near the garden wall. "That, my dear Dolly, is precisely what we must discover. Though I suspect the answer lies not in who would want to kill a gardener, but in who would need to silence a man who knew too much, and who held knowledge as carefully as he tended his roses." Chapter 3. Blood on the Lilies. Miss Marple had found over the years that tea time was the most productive hour for gathering information in an English village. There was something about the ritual of pouring tea and passing cucumber sandwiches that loosened tongues and encouraged confidences. And on Monday afternoon, Mrs. Bantry's drawing room proved no exception to this rule. "More tea, Jane?" Mrs. Bantry asked, hovering over the pot with an expression that suggested she had a great deal more than refreshment to offer. "Thank you, my dear. Just half a cup." Miss Marple settled back in her chair, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm. She'd found that people were far more inclined to speak freely when one appeared to be concentrating on something else entirely. Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice, thought they were quite alone. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about Mr. Carter knowing too much. Well, I've heard something rather interesting from Mrs. Harmon at the post office. It seems Mr. Carter had been having the most dreadful quarrels with Mrs. Greystone lately, over money of all things." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady clicking. "Money? But surely Mr. Carter was well paid for his work. The gardens at Greystone Lodge are quite exceptional. That's just it. He claimed it wasn't about his wages at all. According to Mrs. Harmon, who had it from the cook, Mr. Carter was insisting that old Mr. Greystone had made him a promise before he died. A rather substantial promise. Apparently regarding some sort of inheritance or compensation." "How very interesting," Miss Marple said, pausing to examine her work. "And Mrs. Greystone disputed this claim?" "Flatly denied it," Mrs. Bantry replied. "Said there was nothing in her husband's will about any such arrangement, and that Carter was letting his imagination run wild. But Carter wouldn't let it go. He kept saying that Mr. Greystone had given him his word, and that a gentleman's word was binding, will or no will." Miss Marple considered this. "It's rather like Mrs. Emerson's companion, don't you think? The one who claimed Mrs. Emerson had promised her the cottage when she died, but nothing was written down. These verbal promises can be so very difficult to prove, and so very easy to imagine when one feels one has been slighted." "You think Carter was deluding himself?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that people often remember promises in the way that suits them best. Though I must say Mr. Carter did not strike me as a fanciful man." Their conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Colonel Bantry, looking somewhat harassed. "Ah, Miss Marple, glad you're here. Just been speaking with young Haydock. He's confirmed it was the shears that killed Carter. Single cut to the neck, but he's making rather odd noises about the angle of the wound. Says it's not quite what he'd expect from a simple fall." Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. "Not quite what he'd expect. In what way, Colonel?" "Something about the direction of the cut. Too horizontal, he thinks, for a man falling forward onto shears. More like the shears were drawn across, rather than fallen upon. But then, I'm no medical man. Perhaps these things aren't as straightforward as they seem." "They very rarely are," Miss Marple observed quietly. After Colonel Bantry had departed to his study, Miss Marple asked whether Mrs. Bantry would care to accompany her on a short walk. The afternoon was mild, and she felt the need for some air, and perhaps a brief visit to the post office. "The post office?" "But Jane, you collected your pension only on Friday." "Yes, but I find I'm quite out of stamps," Miss Marple said serenely. "And Doan never knows when one might need to write a letter. The walk to the post office took them past Greystone Lodge, and Miss Marple suggested they might take the footpath that ran along the edge of the property. It was, she pointed out, such a lovely view of the gardens from that angle. The footpath brought them alongside the eastern wall, and as they passed, Miss Marple paused at a gap in the hedge where one could see into the garden proper. Her sharp eyes scanned the beds and borders, moving systematically from one section to another. "Jane, what on earth are you looking for?" "I'm not entirely certain," Miss Marple admitted. "Only that I keep thinking about those footprints and about the position of Mr. Carter's body. He was found by the south wall near the climbing roses, but I noticed yesterday that there were white lilies planted near the eastern edge, close to the pond. I wonder— She fell silent, her gaze fixed on something within the garden. Then, with surprising decisiveness, she opened the small gate in the hedge and stepped onto the property. Jane, we can't just walk into Mrs. Greystone's garden. I'm quite sure she won't mind, Miss Marple said calmly. After all, we're simply admiring the flowers. One can hardly commit a trespass by appreciating beauty. She led the way toward the pond, a small ornamental feature surrounded by smooth stones and bordered with white lilies. The lilies were in full bloom, their petals pristine, except for one cluster near the water's edge. Miss Marple knelt down, ignoring the dampness that immediately seeped through her skirt. On 3 of the lily petals, clearly visible against the white, were small dark stains. Blood, she said quietly. Quite fresh, I should say. Certainly not more than a day or 2 old. Mrs. Bantry drew in a sharp breath. But this is nowhere near where Carter was found. The south wall must be 40 yards away at least. Precisely, Miss Marple said. She examined the ground around the lilies with minute attention. And here, you see, on the grass beside the pond, something has been dropped and retrieved. The grass is pressed flat in a small circle, as though someone bent to pick up an object. She straightened slowly, her eyes scanning the area. A few feet away, half hidden beneath the lower leaves of a hosta plant, something pale caught the light. Miss Marple moved toward it and drew out a lady's glove, soft, cream-colored kid leather, sized for a small hand. Well, Mrs. Bantry breathed, that certainly doesn't belong to Mr. Carter. No. Indeed. Miss Marple turned the glove over in her hands. It's quite good quality, barely worn, the sort of glove one wears for motoring or for garden parties, not for everyday use. She looked up at the house, its windows blank and unrevealing in the afternoon light. I think, Dolly, that we must consider the possibility that Mr. Carter died here, by this pond, and was subsequently moved to the rose garden where he was discovered. But why? Why would anyone move a body? That's rather easier to answer than you might think, Miss Marple said. If one wishes to make a murder appear to be an accident, one must place the body in a location where an accident seems plausible. A man might easily fall from a ladder while pruning roses and strike himself with his own shears. But a man standing beside a pond on level ground with his shears in hand, that presents rather more difficulties for the imagination. They made their way back to the footpath in silence. As they reached the gate, Miss Marple glanced back at the garden one final time. The question now, she said thoughtfully, is whose glove have we found? And why was there an altercation by the pond rather than in the rose garden, where Mr. Carter would naturally have been working at that hour? Mrs. Bantry shivered slightly despite the warmth of the afternoon. It's all becoming rather sinister, Jane. Do you really think someone deliberately killed him? I think, Miss Marple said, that Mr. Carter knew something or possessed something that made him dangerous to someone in that house. And I think that on Sunday evening that danger became too great to ignore. She paused, adjusting her gloves. Murder, my dear Dolly, is rather like gardening. One doesn't simply decide upon it in a moment. One plans, one prepares the ground, one waits for the proper season, and then, when everything is ready, one acts swiftly, and hopes that nature will conceal what human hands have done. Chapter Papis. For the widow at the fence, it was Tuesday morning, when Miss Marple decided that a visit to Mrs. Greystone could no longer be postponed. One did not, of course, wish to intrude upon grief, but there were certain questions that required answers, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that delay often meant the loss of vital information. She walked up the drive to Greystone Lodge at 10, carrying a small basket covered with a white cloth. It contained a jar of her own damson preserves and a few sprigs of lavender from her garden, suitable offerings for a house in mourning. The maid who answered the door was young, barely 20, with reddened eyes that suggested recent tears. Miss Marple recognized her as Annie Pollock, daughter of the woman who did washing for half the village. "I've come to pay my respects to Mrs. Greystone," Miss Marple said gently. "I shan't stay long, but I thought she might appreciate a quiet visitor." Annie showed her through to the conservatory at the rear of the house, a bright glass structure filled with potted ferns and orchids. Mrs. Greystone sat in a wicker chair near the windows, looking out toward the garden. She wore black, though the dress was clearly one she already owned rather than new mourning clothes, and her dark hair was arranged with less care than it had been at the garden show. "Miss Marple," she said, rising with automatic courtesy, "how kind of you to call. I hope I'm not intruding, my dear. I only wish to express my condolences. Mr. Carter had been with your family for a great many years." "I understand. 20 years, Mrs. Greystone said, sinking back into her chair and gesturing for Miss Marple to sit opposite. "He came when my husband's mother was still alive. She engaged him. Actually, Henry always said, Carter knew more about the gardens than any 3 men combined." Miss Marple arranged herself comfortably and set her basket aside. "It must be a great shock, losing someone who had been part of the household for so long." "Yes." The word came out flat, and Mrs. Greystone seemed to realize it. She made a visible effort. "Yes, of course. It's been quite dreadful. The police were here again yesterday, asking the most extraordinary questions. The police do tend to be thorough in such matters. Even in cases of accident, there are formalities to observe." Mrs. Greystone's hands tightened in her lap. "Constable Polk seems to think it might not have been an accident at all. He's been asking about Carter's movements that evening, about whether anyone heard anything unusual. It's all quite distressing." Miss Marple made a small sympathetic sound. "I understand you had some business disagreements with Mr. Carter recently. That must make this all the more difficult." The widow's head came up sharply. "Who told you that?" "My dear, in a village like St. Mary Mead, very little remains private for long. I hope you don't think me impertinent, but I did hear that Mr. Carter believed your late husband had made him certain promises." For a moment, Mrs. Greystone said nothing. Then she stood and moved to the conservatory windows, her back to Miss Marple. "Carter was devoted to my husband," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "Perhaps too devoted. After Henry died, Carter began to imagine things that simply weren't true. He convinced himself that Henry had promised him a share in the estate, or a cottage of his own, or some such arrangement. But there was nothing in the will, Miss Marple. Nothing at all. How very trying for you. And Mr. Carter persisted in his claims. He became quite difficult about it." Mrs. Greystone turned back, and Miss Marple saw that her composure was fraying at the edges. "He said he had been loyal to this family, that he had kept confidences, and deserved recognition for his discretion. It was really most unpleasant. I tried to reason with him, offered him a small bonus in recognition of his years of service, but he refused it. Said it wasn't about money, that it was about honor and promises kept." "Loyalty can turn possessive, I've observed," Miss Marple said quietly. "Rather like the way ivy clings to a wall. At first it seems merely decorative, but in time it can damage the very structure it embraces." Mrs. Greystone gave a short, bitter laugh. "That's very apt, Miss Marple. Carter was rather like ivy, now that you mention it. Always there, always watching, always reminding me of Henry and the way things used to be." She paused, seeming to catch herself. "I shouldn't speak ill of the dead. He was a fine gardener, whatever. His other faults." Miss Marple's gaze had drifted to Mrs. Greystone's hands, which were now gripping the back of a chair. The right hand was wrapped in a neat white bandage. "Oh dear, have you injured yourself, Mrs. Greystone?" The widow glanced down at her hand as though surprised to find it bandaged. "What? Oh yes, a gardening accident. I was cutting back some of the climbing roses on Saturday and caught myself on a thorn. Silly of me, really. I should have been wearing proper gloves. How unfortunate. I do hope it isn't serious. No, just a scratch. Dr. Haydock looked at it yesterday when he was here about Carter, and he said it would heal quickly enough. Miss Marple made appropriately sympathetic noises, but her mind was working with its characteristic precision. A scratch from a rose thorn on Saturday, before Mr. Carter's death on Sunday evening. The timing was interesting, though perhaps not significant. Well, she said, rising to take her leave, I shan't tire you further. Please do let me know if there's anything I can do to help during this difficult time. Mrs. Greystone accompanied her to the conservatory door, and as they passed through the house, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of Annie the maid in the hallway. The girl's eyes met hers for just a moment, and Miss Marple saw something there that she recognized from long experience. Fear, certainly, but also a desperate need to speak. At the front door, Miss Marple paused as though struck by a sudden thought. I wonder, Mrs. Greystone, whether I might trouble Annie to show me the herb garden? I'm considering expanding my own modest efforts, and I understand yours is particularly well maintained. Mrs. Greystone hesitated, then nodded. Of course. Annie, show Miss Marple whatever she wishes to see. Once they were outside and walking toward the kitchen garden, Miss Marple spoke quietly. You have something you wish to tell me, I think. Annie glanced nervously back at the house. I shouldn't say anything, miss. Mrs. Greystone has been good to me, and it's not my place to gossip. I quite understand, my dear. But if you know something that might help explain what happened to Mr. Carter, it would be wrong to keep silent. Sometimes what seems like loyalty is really just fear in disguise. The girl twisted her apron in her hands. It's just that, well, Mrs. Greystone said she hurt her hand on Saturday, but that's not right, miss. I know it's not because I helped her dress for the garden show on Saturday afternoon, and her hands were perfectly fine then. It was Sunday night when she came in late with a bandage already on, and her dress was torn at the hem, and her shoes were covered in mud. Sunday night? You're quite certain? Yes, miss. It was near 10. I'd stayed up to help her undress, as I always do, and when she came in, she looked frightened. She told me to take her dress away and burn it because it was ruined beyond repair. A perfectly good dress, it was too, hardly a year old. Miss Marple patted the girl's arm gently. Thank you, Annie. You've been very brave to tell me this. Now I think you should say nothing more about it to anyone else for the moment. Can you do that? Yes, miss. But Miss Marple, you don't think Mrs. Greystone had anything to do with Mr. Carter's death, do you? She's not a bad person. Truly, she isn't. I'm sure she isn't, my dear, Miss Marple said soothingly. But sometimes even good people find themselves in impossible situations, and they make choices they wouldn't otherwise make. Now show me these herbs, and we'll speak of pleasant things. As Annie led her through the kitchen garden, pointing out the various plantings, Miss Marple's mind was already arranging the pieces of the puzzle. Mrs. Greystone had been out on Sunday night, had come home with her dress torn and muddy, had claimed an injury that occurred after Saturday, and somewhere in all of this was the dropped glove by the pond, the blood on the lilies, and a dead man who had claimed to know secrets worth keeping. Chapter 5. Tea Beside the Pond. Wednesday afternoon found Miss Marple taking tea with Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, in the pleasant sitting room of the vicarage. Mrs. Clement was a sensible woman in her early 40s, blessed with a practical nature and a genuine interest in the welfare of her husband's parishioners. It's all very distressing, Mrs. Clement said, pouring tea from a somewhat chipped pot. The vicar has been quite worried about Mrs. Greystone. He called on her yesterday to offer spiritual comfort, but she seemed more agitated than grieving, if you understand me. Grief takes many forms, Miss Marple observed, accepting her cup. Sometimes what appears as agitation is merely shock expressing itself in unexpected ways. Perhaps, Mrs. Clement said, settling back in her chair. Though I must say, I've been puzzling over something rather odd. On Sunday evening, just as I was preparing for bed, I heard a horse and cart on the lane outside. It must have been close to midnight, which struck me as peculiar. We don't usually have any traffic at that hour, particularly on a Sunday. Miss Marple's interest quickened, though her expression remained placid. A horse and cart, not a motor vehicle? No, definitely a cart. I know the sound well enough. Old Jepson still uses his cart for the farm work, and the Whitakers have that pony trap they're so proud of. This sounded rather heavy, as though it were loaded with something substantial. How very interesting. And it was traveling past the vicarage. That would put it on the road that runs alongside Greystone Lodge. Exactly. So I mentioned it to the vicar, but he was already asleep and didn't hear it. I thought perhaps someone had been taken ill, and Dr. Haydock had been called out, but his motor car makes quite a different sound. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. I wonder whether Constable Polk is aware of this detail. I couldn't say. Should I mention it to him, do you think? It might be helpful, Miss Marple said carefully, though of course it may have no connection whatsoever to Mr. Carter's accident. After tea, Miss Marple suggested a short walk to aid digestion, and Mrs. Clement, always amenable to gentle exercise, agreed readily, by what Miss Marple assured her was pure coincidence. Their route took them once again past Greystone Lodge and along the footpath that bordered the eastern side of the property. Such lovely gardens, Miss Marple remarked, pausing at the gap in the hedge. I wonder, my dear, whether you would indulge an old woman's curiosity. I should so like to examine the pond more closely. The lily arrangement there is really quite remarkable. Mrs. Clement looked slightly doubtful, but followed Miss Marple through the gate and into the garden. They made their way across the lawn toward the ornamental pond, where the white lilies still bloomed in the afternoon sun. Miss Marple moved slowly around the pond's edge, her eyes scanning the ground with minute attention. The blood-stained lilies had been removed. She noticed, cut cleanly at the stem, someone had been doing a bit of tidying. "Look here," she said suddenly, kneeling beside one of the large flat stones that edged the water. This stone has been moved recently. You can see where it's been lifted and set back down, not quite in its original position. The moss underneath is still pale where it was shaded. Mrs. Clement bent to look. You're right. But why would anyone move the stepping stones? That's precisely what I'm wondering, Miss Marple said. When a heavy weight is dragged across uneven ground, one must use whatever firm surfaces are available. Stepping stones would provide exactly such a surface, wouldn't they? Though one might stumble, particularly if the burden were awkward and one were in a hurry. Miss Marple, you're surely not suggesting that someone dragged Mr. Carter's body across these stones? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said gently, that the evidence points to Mr. Carter having died here, by this pond, and having been moved to the rose garden where he was discovered. The blood on the lilies, the displaced stones, the complete absence of any logical reason for him to have been standing here with his pruning shears at that hour, all support this conclusion. She turned slowly, taking in the view from the pond to the gate in the garden wall. One would need to be quite strong to move a body that distance, or one would need help, or perhaps, she paused thoughtfully, one would need a cart. Mrs. Clement drew in a sharp breath. The cart I heard on Sunday night. It does present an interesting possibility, doesn't it? Though, of course, we must not leap to conclusions. There may be a perfectly innocent explanation for everything we've observed. They began walking back toward the gate, but Miss Marple paused once more, her attention caught by something in the flower bed near the path. She bent down and carefully extracted a small brass button from among the soil and mulch. A gentleman's coat button, she observed, turning it over in her palm. Rather good quality, too. Not the sort of thing a gardener would wear, I think. Perhaps it's been there for some time, Mrs. Clement suggested. Perhaps. Though the needle is still quite bright, not tarnished as it would be after prolonged exposure to the elements. Miss Marple wrapped the button in her handkerchief and placed it carefully in her bag. I think, my dear, that we should perhaps inform Constable Polk of what we've discovered, though I suspect he may not be entirely pleased to hear it. As they made their way back to the vicarage, Mrs. Clement voiced the question that had been troubling her. If Mr. Carter was killed by the pond and then moved, that rather rules out the possibility of an accident, doesn't it? I'm afraid it does, Miss Marple agreed. It suggests quite clearly that someone wished his death to appear accidental and took considerable trouble to arrange matters accordingly. That speaks of planning, Mrs. Clement, and of a cool head in a crisis, not the actions of someone who struck out in sudden panic. But who would do such a thing? And why? Miss Marple walked in silence for a moment, her gaze distant. I keep returning to what Annie told me about Mrs. Greystone returning home on Sunday night with her dress torn and muddy. And I think about Mr. Carter's claims of promises made and secrets kept. Blackmail is a cruel thing, my dear. It's rather like a parasitic vine that slowly strangles its host. Eventually, the host must either die or cut the vine away, regardless of the cost. They reached the vicarage gate, and Miss Marple paused before taking her leave. I think, she said quietly, that matters are moving toward a resolution, but there are still pieces missing from this puzzle. And until we find them, we cannot see the full picture. The question now is not whether Mr. Carter was murdered, but by whom, and whether they acted alone or had help in concealing what they'd done. Chapter. It's the key to the greenhouse. Thursday morning brought rain, a steady drizzle that turned the village lanes to mud, and kept most of St. Mary Mead indoors. Miss Marple was in her sitting room, ostensibly working on her knitting, when Constable Polk arrived at her door looking decidedly uncomfortable. Miss Marple, he began, removing his wet helmet and holding it awkwardly in his large hands. I've come to ask you about these discoveries you've been making at Greystone Lodge. Mrs. Clement mentioned something about stepping stones and buttons, and I thought I'd better hear it from you directly. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and gestured for him to sit. How very conscientious of you, Constable. I was planning to call at the police house this very afternoon. Would you care for some tea? Over tea and slices of seed cake, Miss Marple recounted her observations with careful precision. Constable Polk listened with a deepening frown, making occasional notes in his official book. I don't mind telling you, Miss Marple, that this puts rather a different complexion on matters. Dr. Haydock has been making noises about the angle of that cut, and now you're saying the body was moved. He sighed heavily. The superintendent won't be pleased. He'd already closed the case as accidental death. I'm sure the superintendent will be grateful to have the truth brought to light, whatever form that truth may take, Miss Marple said soothingly. Though I confess there is one detail that continues to puzzle me. Has Mr. Carter's greenhouse been thoroughly examined? Polk consulted his notes. We had a look round naturally, nothing seemed out of place. His tools were all tidy, pots arranged proper, seeds labeled and such. Carter was a methodical man. Everyone says so. And the greenhouse was locked when you arrived? That's right. Found the door locked on Sunday morning. Had to get the spare key from Mrs. Greystone to have a look inside. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythmic clicking. But Mr. Carter always carried his greenhouse key on his person. I understand it was one of his peculiarities. He locked the greenhouse after his evening rounds and kept the key in his waistcoat pocket. Polk's frown deepened. Now that you mention it, we didn't find any key on the body. Assumed it had been in the greenhouse all along, but if what you're saying is true... I think, Miss Marple said gently, that another visit to the greenhouse might prove illuminating. And if you wouldn't mind the company of an elderly lady with an interest in gardening, I should very much like to accompany you. An hour later, Miss Marple stood inside Mr. Carter's greenhouse while rain drummed steadily on the glass roof overhead. It was a substantial structure, perhaps 30 feet long, with wooden staging down both sides and a brick path running down the center. Everything was exactly as Constable Polk had described, neat and orderly, the tools hanging in their proper places. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes had caught something that the constable had missed. On the brick floor near the far end of the greenhouse, there was a faint discoloration. She knelt down, ignoring the dampness that seeped through her skirt, and examined it closely. "Fertilizer," she said after a moment, "spilled and then partially cleaned up. You can see where someone tried to sweep it away, but the residue remains in the cracks between the bricks." Polk bent to look. Carter was always careful with his materials. Seems odd he'd spill fertilizer and not clean it up properly. Indeed. Miss Marple's gaze moved to Asmall workbench near where the fertilizer had spilled. On its surface were several clay pots, most empty and waiting to be used. But one pot, larger than the others, had been recently filled with fresh soil and held a rose cutting that showed signs of very recent planting. "This rose was planted within the last few days," Miss Marple observed. "The soil around its base is still loose, not yet settled by watering. I wonder why Mr. Carter would have been taking cuttings at this time of year." Early June is not the ideal season for propagating roses. She reached for the pot, then paused. "Constable, would you be so good as to lift this pot and tip out its contents? My hands are not as steady as they once were, and I should hate to damage the plant if it proves innocent." Polk did as she requested, carefully inverting the pot and tapping out the soil onto a sheet of newspaper from the workbench. The rose cutting came free, its roots trailing dirt, and something else fell out with a metallic clink, a brass key, perhaps 3 inches long, with soil still clinging to its surface. "Well, Polk breathed. "That'll be Carter's greenhouse key, or I'm a Dutchman." Miss Marple leaned closer. Wrapped around the key, partially concealed by soil, was a piece of cloth. Polk extracted it carefully and held it up to the light. It was a handkerchief, once white but now stained with dark brown marks that could only be dried blood. "Someone hid these things here," Polk said slowly. "After Carter was killed, someone came into this greenhouse, buried the key in this bloodied rag, and planted a rose cutting over them to hide what they'd done." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Rather like burying evidence in the garden, hoping it would take root and flourish into something innocent. But a guilty conscience, Constable, is rather like a weed. One can bury it as deep as one likes, but eventually it works its way to the surface." She turned her attention back to the floor where the fertilizer had been spilled. Now that she knew what to look for, she could see that the darker discoloration was not entirely fertilizer. Mixed in with the granular residue were stains that looked suspiciously like blood, partially cleaned, but not entirely erased. "I think," she said quietly, "that we may have found where Mr. Carter received his fatal injury. Not by the pond at all, but here in his greenhouse. Someone met him here. There was a struggle. The shears were used, and then the body was removed to make the death appear accidental. But why move it to the pond first, then to the rose garden? Why not take it straight to where it was found?" Miss Marple considered this. Perhaps because moving a body through the garden in darkness required help, and that help did not arrive immediately. The pond is much closer to the greenhouse than the rose garden. If one needed to hide a body temporarily while arrangements were made, the shadows near the pond would provide excellent cover. She walked slowly down the length of the greenhouse, her eyes scanning every surface. Near the door, she paused at a row of hanging tools. There was a gap where something had been removed, the dust pattern on the wall showing clearly where an implement had hung for some time. "What usually hangs here, I wonder?" Polk examined the space. "Could be anything, spade, fork, hoe. We'd need to check with someone who knew Carter's system." Or, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, it could be a pair of pruning shears, the ones found beside Mr. Carter's body. If they were taken from here after being used as a weapon and then carefully positioned near the body to suggest an accident, it would explain why they were lying beside his hand rather than clutched within it. She turned to face the constable. I think we must accept, Constable Polk, that this was a carefully planned murder made to look like an accident. Someone lured or met Mr. Carter in his greenhouse on Sunday evening, killed him, and then went to considerable trouble to arrange the scene to deceive the authorities. The key and the bloodied handkerchief were hidden in the hope that they would never be discovered. But murderers, like gardeners, sometimes underestimate the persistence of those who know where to look and what questions to ask. Polk was making copious notes, his face grim. I'll need to report this to the superintendent immediately, and I'll need to question Mrs. Greystone again and anyone else who had access to this greenhouse. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, though I suspect, Constable, that the answer lies not in who had access to the greenhouse, but in who had reason to fear what Mr. Carter knew and what he might reveal. Blackmail, as I have observed before, is a dangerous game. It can turn quite suddenly and fatally against the blackmailer. Chapter 7. A Letter Buried in the Soil. By Friday afternoon, the rain had cleared, leaving the gardens of St. Mary Mead fresh and gleaming in their nude sunshine. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night pondering the various threads of the mystery, decided that a return visit to Greystone Lodge was necessary. There was something about that newly planted rose cutting in the greenhouse that continued to trouble her, and experience had taught her that such persistent unease was usually the mind's way of signaling an overlooked detail. She found Mrs. Bantry more than willing to accompany her, particularly after hearing about the discoveries in the greenhouse. Jane, you don't really think Mrs. Greystone killed Carter herself, do you? She's such a slight woman, and he was a strong man, even at his age. Strength isn't always physical, my dear Dolly, and desperation can lend surprising capability to the most unlikely people. Though I confess, I'm beginning to suspect that Mrs. Greystone may not have been acting entirely alone. They arrived at Greystone Lodge to find the house in some state of agitation. Constable Polk's motorbike stood by the front gate, and through the open drawing-room window they could hear raised voices. Perhaps we should come back another time, Mrs. Bantry whispered. On the contrary, Miss Marple said serenely. I think this may be exactly the right time. They were shown into the morning room by a flustered Annie who looked as though she had been crying. After a few moments, Mrs. Greystone entered, her face pale and set. Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, I'm afraid this is not a convenient time. The police have been here since early morning, and they seem determined to turn the entire house upside down. I quite understand, my dear. We shan't intrude long. I only wondered whether I might take one more look at the rose garden. I'm considering entering the competition next year, you see, and Mr. Carter's methods were so admired. Mrs. Greystone hesitated, then nodded distractedly. Yes, of course. Annie can show you out. I must return to Constable Polk. He has the most absurd notion that Carter was killed in the greenhouse, and that someone tried to conceal evidence there. After she had left, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry made their way through the garden, but Miss Marple did not head toward the rose beds near the south wall. Instead, she walked directly to the spot where the newly planted rose cutting had been disturbed, just outside the greenhouse door. That rose cutting that was planted over the hidden key, she said thoughtfully, came from somewhere. Mr. Carter was a methodical man. He wouldn't have taken a cutting without a reason, and certainly not at this time of year, unless, of course, he didn't take it at all. She knelt down beside the rose bed where the cutting had originally been planted, before being moved to the greenhouse. This soil here showed clear signs of recent disturbance, and among the established plants, one gap was visible where a young shoot had been removed. Someone took this cutting after Mr. Carter's death, Miss Marple observed, and used it to cover the evidence they'd buried in the greenhouse. But in their haste, they didn't notice that they were disturbing Mr. Carter's careful planting scheme. She began to examine the soil around the gap, her fingers working gently through the earth. Mrs. Bantry watched with growing fascination as Miss Marple's systematic search revealed a small depression in the soil, as though something had been pressed into the earth and later removed. "There was something here," Miss Marple murmured. "Something buried deliberately, not as deep as the key in the greenhouse, but concealed nonetheless." She continued her careful excavation, moving outward from the original gap, and then, perhaps 6 inches from where the rose cutting had been taken, her fingers encountered something that was not soil. With infinite care, she drew out a damp, folded envelope, its paper softened by moisture but still intact. The address on the front, written in a firm, masculine hand, read simply, "L.G. Lydia Greystone." "Mrs. Greystone," Mrs. Bantry breathed. Miss Marple opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink somewhat blurred but still legible. She read it aloud, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was reading. "If you don't keep your promise, the truth about your husband will come out, and you'll lose everything. I have been patient long enough. The agreement stands whether you acknowledge it or not. You know what I witnessed, and you know what it would mean if others learned of it. I expect your answer by Sunday evening." The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting matched the address on the envelope, and both were clearly written by the same hand that had won prizes for the neat labeling of seed packets in Mr. Carter's greenhouse. "Blackmail," Mrs. Bantry said faintly. He was blackmailing her? "So it would appear," Miss Marple said, folding the letter carefully. "Though what truth about Mr. Greystone he was threatening to reveal, we do not yet know. Something scandalous enough that Mrs. Greystone would do almost anything to keep it hidden. But Jane, if Carter buried this letter in the rose garden, why would anyone dig it up again? Surely leaving it hidden would have been safer." "An excellent question," Miss Marple said, standing slowly and brushing soil from her hands. "I think perhaps the letter was buried by Mr. Carter himself as a form of insurance, a threat kept in reserve, so to speak. But after his death, someone realized that if the police conducted a thorough search, as indeed they have, the letter might be discovered. So they dug it up, intending perhaps to destroy it entirely. But then Constable Polk arrived unexpectedly, or some other interruption occurred, and in their panic they simply reburied it in a slightly different location, taking the rose cutting to use as camouflage in the greenhouse where they'd hidden the more damning evidence of the key and bloodied handkerchief." She gazed toward the house where Constable Polk could be seen through the window, still questioning Mrs. Greystone. The question now becomes not whether Mrs. Greystone had a motive for murder, which clearly she did, but whether she had the physical capability and the nerve to carry it out alone. A man like Carter would not have been easy to overcome, even if taken by surprise. "You think she had help?" Mrs. Bantry said. "I think it increasingly likely. Someone strong enough to move a body. Someone with access to a cart that could be heard traveling on the lane near midnight. Someone who cared enough about Mrs. Greystone's predicament to commit murder on her behalf." Miss Marple paused. "Or perhaps someone who had their own reasons for wanting Carter silenced." They made their way back toward the house, and as they rounded the corner of the building, Miss Marple observed a figure she had not previously noticed. A man in his 30s, well-built and dressed in a chauffeur's uniform, stood near the motor house, polishing the Greystone motor car. "Music. Who is that?" Miss Marple asked quietly. That's James Hill, the chauffeur. He's been with Mrs. Greystone since she moved here after her marriage. Came down from London with her, I believe. Very devoted to her by all accounts. Miss Marple watched the chauffeur for a long moment. There was something in the way he kept glancing toward the house, in the tension visible in his shoulders, that spoke of more than mere concern for his employer. Devoted, she repeated softly. Yes, I'm beginning to see how that particular virtue might have played a role in this tragedy. Devotion can be as dangerous as hatred when pushed to extremes. She noticed something else as well. The chauffeur's jacket, hanging on a hook near the motorhouse door, had a button missing from the front, a brass button, she thought, of exactly the type she had found in the flower bed near the pond. Dolly, she said quietly, I think we should speak with Constable Pock. There are several pieces of this puzzle that are beginning to fit together, but I need to verify one or two more details before I can see the complete picture, and I rather think that Mr. James Hill may be able to help us with those details, whether he wishes to or not. Chapter 8. The footprint in the flower bed. Constable Pock listened to Miss Marple's account with an expression that shifted from skepticism to grudging respect as she produced first the letter, then the button, and finally her observations about the chauffeur's missing button and his evident anxiety. You've been busy, Miss Marple, he said, examining the letter with care. Though I'm not sure the superintendent will be pleased to hear that evidence has been dug up from the garden by a civilian. I quite understand your position, Constable. However, I think you'll find that this letter establishes a clear motive for Mrs. Greystone. The question now is whether she acted alone or had an accomplice. Pock consulted his notebook. As it happens, we found something ourselves this morning. There's a clear footprint behind the rose trellis near where the body was found. A woman's boot, size 4 or 5. Matches the boots we saw in Mrs. Greystone's wardrobe. When I confronted her with this, she admitted she was in the garden that night. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. Indeed, and what was her explanation? She claimed she went to the greenhouse around 9 o'clock on Sunday evening to plead with Carter to stop his threats. Say she'd been hounding her for weeks about this supposed promise her husband made, and she decided to offer him a final settlement. But when she arrived, she found him in a rage. According to her, he grabbed her arm, tore her dress, and when she tried to pull away, he came at her with the shears. She says she pushed him in panic, he stumbled, and thus shears did the rest. How very convenient, Miss Marple observed. And what of the body being moved? What of the blood by the pond and the evidence hidden in the greenhouse? Pock shifted uncomfortably. She's saying she panicked after he fell, realized how bad it looked, and tried to make it appear like an accident by moving him to the rose garden where he'd been working earlier. Claims she dragged him there herself, though how a woman her size managed that I couldn't say. No, Miss Marple said firmly. That won't do at all, Constable. The story has the ring of partial truth, which is often more dangerous than an outright lie. Let me ask you this. Which direction were those footprints pointing? Toward the greenhouse or away from it? Pock consulted his notes again, then frowned. Away from it, heading back toward the house. In fact, precisely. If Mrs. Greystone's account were true, if she had fled in panic after Carter fell, we would expect to see footprints approaching the scene, showing signs of struggle and confusion, and then running away. But instead, the footprints show someone walking away in an orderly fashion, someone who had already completed whatever business brought them to the garden. That suggests quite a different sequence of events. She rose from her chair and began to pace slowly, her mind working through the pieces of the puzzle. Let me propose an alternative scenario. Constable. Mrs. Greystone did indeed receive Carter's threatening letter, demanding that she honor some supposed promise by Sunday evening. She realized that Carter would never stop, that he would bleed her dry financially and emotionally. But she also knew she couldn't overpower him herself. So she confided in someone devoted to her, someone who would do anything to protect her. The chauffeur, Mrs. Bantry whispered. Mr. James Hill. Yes, I suspect their relationship may be rather more than that of employer and servant, though that's merely conjecture. What matters is that a plan was formed. Mrs. Greystone would go to the greenhouse on Sunday evening, ostensibly to negotiate with Carter, but in reality to distract him while Mr. Hill entered from behind. Miss Marple paused by the window, looking out toward Greystone Lodge. Carter was killed in the greenhouse, probably struck from behind. While his attention was on Mrs. Greystone, the shears were used to make it appear as though he'd been injured in a fall. But then they faced a problem. They needed to move the body to a location where an accident would seem plausible. But moving a body through the garden required both strength and time. So they moved him first to the pond, hidden in the shadows, while they made their plans. The cart that Mrs. Clement heard, Pock said slowly. Exactly. Mr. Hill, who has both access to the estate's cart and the strength to handle it, brought it round at midnight. They loaded the body, transported it to the rose garden, where Carter had been working earlier in the day, and arranged the scene to look like an accident. Mrs. Greystone then walked back to the house, leaving those telltale footprints, while Mr. Hill returned the cart and disposed of his bloody jacket. She turned back to face them. Except he didn't dispose of the jacket, did he? He kept it, perhaps meaning to destroy it later, but not daring to burn it immediately in case the smell attracted attention, and he lost a button, probably when he was dragging the body through the garden. A small oversight, but a fatal one. Polk was already on his feet. I'll need to question Hill immediately. If what you're saying is true, Miss Marple, then we're looking at a conspiracy to murder, not a crime of passion. I think you'll find, Constable, that it was both. Mrs. Greystone may have been desperate enough to wish Carter dead, but it was passion of a different sort that moved Mr. Hill to help her, the sort of passion that makes a man commit murder for a woman he loves, even knowing the terrible consequences that must follow. They found James Hill still at the motor house, though his pretense of polishing the car had ceased. He stood with his back against the wall, his face gray and his hands trembling slightly. When he saw Constable Polk approaching with Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry, something seemed to break inside him. Dick knew someone would work it out eventually, he said quietly. I told her we should confess, that trying to cover it up would only make things worse. But she was so frightened, so desperate. I couldn't let her face it alone. Polk cautioned him firmly, then asked, Are you saying you killed Edwin Carter? Not alone, though. I struck the blow. It was Mrs. Greystone who planned it. No, that's not fair. It was my idea, really. She only told me about the blackmail, about what Carter was threatening to reveal. I said we should deal with him, that I wouldn't let him destroy her. And what was he threatening to reveal? Miss Marple asked gently. Hill's face twisted with bitter amusement. That her precious Henry Greystone was carrying on an affair with a woman in the village during the last year of his life, that he died on his way back from meeting her, not from a heart attack in his study, as everyone believed. Carter saw it all, knew all about it, and threatened to make it public unless Mrs. Greystone paid him off. She would have been ruined, become a laughingstock, the wronged wife, the last to know. I couldn't bear to see her humiliated that way. So, you killed him? Polk said. Yes. We arranged to meet him in the greenhouse Sunday evening. She distracted him while I came in through the back door, hit him from behind, then used his own shears to make it look like an accident. We panicked afterward, moved him to the rose garden, tried to hide the evidence, but we weren't clever enough, were we? He looked at Miss Marple with something like respect. You saw through it all. I should have known better than to think we could deceive St. Mary Mead's own detective. I'm no detective, Mr. Hill, Miss Marple said quietly. I'm simply an old woman who understands that panic, as I've observed before, rarely moves in tidy lines. And you and Mrs. Greystone, despite your best efforts, left a trail of small, untidy details that spoke louder than any planned deception ever could. Chapter 9. The Thorn That Drew Blood. The evening had drawn in by the time Constable Polk finished taking James Hill's statement at the police house. Miss Marple, who had been asked to remain available should any clarifications be needed, sat in Mrs. Bantry's drawing room, watching the last light fade from the garden outside. I still can't quite believe it, Mrs. Bantry said, pouring yet another cup off tea. That quiet chauffeur and Mrs. Greystone both involved in murder. It seems so impossible. Murder is rarely impossible, my dear. It's simply unthinkable, until it happens. And then one wonders how one failed to see it coming. Miss Marple set down her cup with a small sigh. Though I must confess there's something about Mr. Hill's confession that troubles me. Troubles you? But surely he's admitted everything. Yes, that's rather the problem. He's admitted too much too readily. In my experience, people who commit crimes of passion are either utterly defiant or utterly broken. Mr. Hill seemed almost relieved to confess, as though he'd been carrying a burden he was glad to set down. Before Mrs. Bantry could respond, there was a commotion outside. A motor car pulled up at speed, and moments later, Constable Polk appeared at the door, his face flushed with excitement and confusion. Miss Marple, I need you to come back to the station. There's been a development. The police house was a modest building on the high street, and in its small back room, Miss Marple found a scene of considerable tension. James Hill sat at a table, his face stubborn and pale. Mrs. Greystone stood near the window, her composure finally shattered, tears streaming down her face. And standing between them, looking thoroughly uncomfortable, was Dr. Haydock. Perhaps you'd better explain, Doctor, Constable Polk said heavily. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. I've been examining the jacket that Hill wore on Sunday night, the one with the missing button. There's blood on it, as we expected, but when I looked more carefully, I found something else caught in the fabric near the cuff, a rose thorn, broken off and embedded quite deeply in the wool. A rose thorn? Miss Marple said. But surely that's not unusual for someone who's been working in a rose garden? That's what I thought at first. But this particular thorn is from a climbing rose, and it's been driven into the fabric with considerable force. The sort